Thanks everybody for coming out tonight and bearing with us in some slightly warm temperatures. I'm going to be right back up after the talk ends to call your signing groups. So just sit tight then if you want to stay for the signing line. For now, I'm going to give this mic to Molly Worthen from UNC, who's going to give a proper introduction for the man we came here to see, Frank Bruni. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you. This is so fun, Frank, to get to be here to talk to you about your book. We all know Frank Bruni, but I will introduce him. He has been a journalist for more than 3 decades.
We don't need to talk about timeline.
And I was
actually just a couple of years now. Yeah, okay. I'm 32.
I was looking at your CV and reflecting that you have had all the jobs at the New York Times that are both the most fun and the hardest, it seemed to me. So, White House correspondent, Rome bureau chief, chief restaurant critic. Most recently,
which one of this was hard other than White House correspondent?
You just did them long enough that they became the daily routine. He's written many books. For the past few years, he has taught some classes mostly related to journalism over at Duke. And today, I get to talk to him about the new book, The Age of Grievance. And of course, we will reserve some time at the end for audience questions. I just want to start where perhaps it's obvious to start, thinking about the books you've written. You've covered so many topics, from college admissions, meatloaf recipes, how to deal with disability. So why the topic grievance now? What made this urgent?
Well, can I first just thank you for doing this and being here. Molly is a treasured friend and someone I admire very much. And if you are not reading her in the Assembly, and she also writes for the New York Times with some frequency, I'm an enormous fan, so I'm just honored to be here with you. We did this a couple of years ago for The Beauty of Dusk, and I promised not to write any other books, so I won't prevail upon you again. Okay? But I'm a huge admirer, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Flyleaf for hosting me again. Why did I write this? It just seems to me that over the past decade or two, in a kind of steady arc, we're getting more and more dysfunctional as a country in terms of the way we conduct our political debates, the way we deal with one another, the way we deal with people who disagree with us. And I just feel like we've reached a sort of crisis point of far too many Americans entering the public square, beginning their political debates from a posture of, let me tell you how aggrieved I am. Let me tell you why I have it even worse than you do. Let me tell you what you owe me. Let me tell you who's to blame. And let me tell you how I'd like to see us take revenge against that person. I think it is a kind of crazy age of grievance thing that we have one candidate for president this cycle whose probably signature line at this point for this election is, I am your retribution. That sort of says it all. So I just felt like it was time to take a long, hard look at how we got to this dysfunctional point, which I hope I do in the book. You've read it, you'll tell me. Even more so what it's costing us. I spend a lot of time on that. And then finally, what are some things we might do to pivot beyond it in a better direction? Because I really think this country is in trouble, and I think we are treating our democracy in a cavalier and corrosive fashion.
We are in a moment that definitely is different, and I want to ask you more about that in a bit. But it also seems like Americans have a lot of practice at this mindset at some level. I teach history at UNC. When I think about the chapters of American history that I cover, I think of a lot of groups that have grievances, many of which are legitimate. I think of persecuted immigrants, fleeing religious persecution. I think of indigenous people. You write in the book about the context of the American Revolution and the word grievance very much showing up in the colonists' language. So how far back do you think we need to go to tell this story? And in telling it, how do we distinguish between a legitimate grievance and one that is not?
Well, you just kind of put your finger on something really interesting, which is today it's largely understood when you hear the word grievance that the connotation is negative, right? No one looks at the title of this book and thinks, wait, grievance is a great thing. If you left this room tonight and you Googled grievance and you did a kind of Google refined thing in the last week, last month, you would find that when it pops up in news stories and columns and whatever, it is almost always used in a pejorative sense. because our complaints, let's use that word, have proliferated, metastasized, become indiscriminate to a degree where it's kind of assumed that someone may be making too much of something. But you are right, we're a nation born of grievance. You could apply the word grievance before it acquired all these negative connotations to some of the most important social justice movements in our history. The word grievances appears in the First Amendment, right? That citizens have a right to have their grievances redressed. So the problem is somewhere along the way, and I can't say exactly where, we kind of began, I think, to be indiscriminate in a new way about our grievances. I think social media is a big part of this. It's a big accelerant. The point in history that I go back to in the book that looks so much like today in a way that until you revisit it, you're like, wow, this is deja vu. This is that old French saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same, is in the late 80s and early 90s. If you look at a clip of Robert Bork, if you listen to a clip of, in fact, I was doing an interview with Firing Line last week, and they played it as a kind of visual during our interview and asked me to respond to it. But it was of Robert Bork talking about this crazy radical egalitarianism that was upon the land, and you realize that was just wokeness with more syllables, right? It looked exactly like this moment. But then for some reason, and I speculate a little bit on why in the book, there was a lull, and now we're back to that kind of cultural conflict, but I think even more intense. And I think it's the product of, social media is a big part of it. I think it's the product of terrible political leadership in many cases, and I think, and this really saddens me the most, it's a problem of the nation's turn toward a kind of pessimism that used to be antithetical to what we understood this country and the American psyche to be. We have become such a pessimistic country. And if you no longer believe that the future will be brighter than yesterday, if you don't believe the pie is growing, you have a much different relationship with your piece of it and with other people. You see it as a zero-sum game. You see somebody else's good fortune as your potential misfortune. You become kind of competitive and petty in a way that I think really, really degrades the country and getting stuff done that we need to lift everybody up.
That pessimism seems so crucial, and I'm thinking about the context of the 1990s to which you're comparing our current era. And what I associate with the 90s, the Cold War was just over, the end of history. We had this confidence in the country's kind of purpose and in the world historical stage. Is that the difference? Thinking back on what you were observing as a reporter at that time, would you point to, a sort of sense of kind of national confidence that was true then that is not true now when we're much more uncertain about our state in the global economy?
I think there was an assumption, you mentioned the end of history, which, and I can pronounce nobody's name correctly, so would you say his name?
Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you, yeah. I think it's so interesting that I went back and looked at that as I was writing in the book, but I also read in its entirety. He revised his assessment and what he was saying a couple of years ago. He wrote a book called Liberalism and Its Discontents. And what it basically was, oops, I guess I was wrong about the end of history. I guess I was wrong that we turned a corner and liberal democracy was going to sweep through the Western world and everybody was going to be happier than ever before. I think a lot of what happened in terms of our current pessimism is there was this bravado, there was this set of false assumptions that once the Cold War was over, it was just smooth sailing. And it wasn't, because people and societies are much more complicated than that.
Was there, a degree of honesty and authenticity that was present in the 90s that is less true now? I was struck reading the book, especially early in the book, you have some vignettes from Fox News, people like Sean Hannity, and you really characterize the performance of grievance and the way, the media context makes the performance, as opposed to the sincere airing of grievance, maybe more tempting. Is that a real difference, or is that a difference we're tempted to produce?
No, it's an enormous difference. If you go back to the late 90s, if you go back, the years are in the book, I don't have them at the front of mind, but we haven't had MSNBC for that long. We haven't had Fox News in its present form for that long. We have not been living that long with a cable universe in which you had hundreds of options. With the internet, in which in terms of newsletters and blogs, et cetera, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of options, and with social media. And they've created a kind of grievance economy where they who shout loudest, they who are angriest, they who stir you up the most get your eyeballs, get your clicks, get your shares, and all of that. That's a hugely profound difference between 20 years ago and today. And the great promise of connectedness that we thought the internet was, it turns out, no, it's actually a better agent of disconnectedness. And I think we're really stumped about what to do about that. Like, can we regulate our way out of that? Unclear. Can we design new social media platforms that privilege consensus versus conflict and people will actually use them? Unclear. I mean, this is an unfinished story, but I don't think that you can overemphasize changes in media, including and foremost social media.
Maybe also there's the way in which our experience of social media is a part of the texture of our daily habits. And one thing I think you do so successfully in this book is move back and forth between these really big picture sort of historical trends, but also the ways in which our experience of everyday life and social interaction have changed. And this is helpful because there's something, I don't know, really counterintuitive about the idea that being semi-permanently aggrieved is this default posture, because it's so unattractive. I mean, no one wants to go on a date with someone who's complaining all the time. So the question is sort of, how does this happen?
Unless it's a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode.
Yes.
Then I think that's a whole plot.
But I picked maybe my favorite passage in the book. Would you mind reading just a couple of pages?
I love that this is your favorite passage. I feel like I want to deconstruct with you at some point what that tells me about you. Okay, where's this? Is it the bookmark?
It's start where the line is, and then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Should I give a little context about where this is in the book?
Sure.
In the book, I talk about when I'm looking at all the various reasons why we may be at each other's throats. I make the point that I feel like our service economy has more tiers and more fine-grained tiers, T-I-E-R-S, than it ever had before. And so there are all of these microclimates of privilege, and everybody is looking around them, and they're seeing somebody who is a little bit more coddled than them, and then the people more coddled. I mean, you can belong to 10 different kinds of gyms. You can have 10 different kinds of memberships to those gyms, and then there can be like 5 different altitudes of trainers, right? And everybody is not just kind of choosing these very specific and multiplying tiers of privilege, but then flaunting where they've tucked themselves to everyone else. And I think it's a potent engine of envy. Okay. When I was a teenager in the late 1970s and early 1980s and went to the big concerts of major performers, different sections of seating had different prices, but they fell into a few general categories. A person's proximity to the stage often had less to do with her financial reserves than with how quickly and heroically she'd acted to get her tickets. I once showed up at the box office of what was then called the Hartford Civic Center at 3 in the morning in pitch darkness to be in place when tickets for a Queen concert went on sale several hours later. That was the surest path to the best seats. My friends and I ended up in the 8th row, where I caught Freddie Mercury's tambourine when he threw it into the crowd at the conclusion of the band's final song. And there was something egalitarian about it. But the seating maps for various stops on Taylor Swift's 2023 tour revealed scores and scores of price tags, tailored with extreme specificity to the precise desirability of the vantage point. The highest ones were many thousands of dollars above the lowest ones, a family of 4 or 5 posting photos of themselves among other ecstatic Swifties as showtime neared was in some cases announcing to the world its ability to drop $10,000 or more on one night's entertainment. But while the price range for Swift exceeded the price range for a garden variety superstar, the exacting tiering of the experience was a common phenomenon in the world of live music. When I was a teenager, school essentially came in 2 sizes, public or private. Now, private is the starting point, with many costly but broadly applied add-ons: the tutors for special subjects, the separate tutor for standardized exams, the individual sports coach, the independent college admissions consultant who, for a hefty fee, does more plotting and pacifying than the counselors already on the school staff are able to. When I was a teenager, you were posh if you belonged to a private gym versus, say, the YMCA. The brand of that gym and the level of your membership weren't relevant. Now, Planet Fitness and Equinox are solar systems of pampering apart. And at some of the equinoxes of the galaxy, different clients pay significantly different sums for personal trainers in accordance with that ab whisperer's determined gradation of expertise. Those clients can also pay a surcharge for a better locker room, a surcharge for certain other sanctums. And none of that is unnoticed by or unnoticeable to the other customers. Its noticeableness is perhaps part of the point. Aspiration and perspiration go together. The emphasis of the American economy may have changed over the years from manufacturing to services, but one product we make in abundance is distinctions.
What I so appreciate about what you crystallize there and elaborate in that part of the book is the way this fleshes out our understanding of the impact of social media and what's happened to our relationships, because it makes clear that at the same time that our relationships with other humans have so commonly taken on this very thin, this attenuated form on these glowing rectangles, they have this element of them, the comparative element, has gotten supercharged.
No, that's totally true. I mean, and in terms of these different, and I call them with credit to Tom Nichols at The Atlantic, who used this phrase in something he wrote, I call them these various engines of envy in contemporary society. And in social media, I mean, everybody, it seems if you're on Instagram or certain byways of TikTok, I don't spend a lot of time on TikTok, it confuses me. I'm a curmudgeon in that sense. But it seems like everybody is always at a wedding in the Caribbean, clinking champagne glasses while the sun sets spectacularly behind them, right? Every day of every hour. You don't see people posting on their Instagram or on their TikTok an image from the day when they came home defeated from work, were broken up with by their longtime boyfriend and girlfriend, got into bed with a way too big bowl of heavily buttered popcorn, spilled it all over themselves and cried.
You sound like you're speaking autobiographically.
I'm describing my Friday night. But you don't like that kind of image doesn't appear on anybody's Instagram feed, right? Social media, among all of the other bad influences on us, it tells us really destructive lies about the way other people are living. And it leaves you in a posture where you constantly feel like you have it worse, you've been left out, you're not measuring up.
And it's not that it's brand new, of course. I mean, conspicuous consumption, parking your new car right prominently in your driveway so that your neighbors see it. This is a cliche of kind of, America for a long time. But there's something accelerated and much more extreme about the character of this sort of comparison now.
Yeah, no, I begin the chapter you had me read from, I begin with this sort of imagining of the Johnsons and the Joneses and their different trips to Disney World, and how every step of the way they get to the airport, the Joneses are using the clear line, like they've ascended to the realm above TSA pre-check, and the Johnsons, it takes them an hour longer to get through security. They get to the plane, they're boarding at different times. The overhead space is gone by the time the Johnsons get there. They get to a hotel, it's another line. The Joneses are honors members at Hilton or Marriott or wherever the hell it is, right? And just speed. Amusement parks. The last time I went to an amusement park, it was many years ago, but my siblings all do fairly well for a living, and it was their kids who were the main thrust of the experience. And we had these kind of special tickets so that we were speeded to the front of every line. And I was absolutely mortified. But I thought, like in so many sectors of our lives, we see that repeated over and over again. And that's something well beyond what I think anybody would have called conspicuous consumption 25 years ago. It's something beyond that, and I think much more pernicious in terms of how it makes us feel about one another.
So part of this is that people who organize the business side of our experience of amusement parks and travel, they've just gotten much better at monetizing these micro distinctions in a way that is kind of unprecedented.
They seem to understand human vanity in a special way, you know.
This seems too important because this phenomenon is a nonpartisan matter.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because it seems like otherwise you are harder on the right, I would say, in this book than on the left. Is that fair?
I guess I would say that's fair, but I would say because that's appropriate, right? No. It's important to address this, and thank you for bringing it up. The hardest thing about writing this book and talking about this book is I do mean for this book to be the adjective even doesn't really work, but not even-handed, but balanced in a certain way. You say I'm harder on the right, but in that statement is an acknowledgement that I look at behavior across the political spectrum, and I have a whole lot to say about what I believe to be the excesses of the left and some of the people who call themselves social justice warriors. And I hope we can talk about that just a little bit before we go to questions. But what makes this hard to write about is I wanted to make the point that these excessively aggrieved postures, these overwrought claims of grievance, are present across the political spectrum, and it's a sort of psychological and political dynamic that seems to be suprapartisan, whatever the right word for, not partisan, for not one side or the other. But I also think it's important to say that to not get stuck in, on the one hand, on the other, both sides, not get stuck in false equivalences. I think right now grievance on the right poses a much more profound threat to our country than grievance on the left. It is on the right that you have a disproportionate amount of organized political violence. Actors on the right were plotting to kidnap and God knows do what else to Gretchen Whitmer. It is on the right that you have a magnitude and intensity of election denialism that produced January 6th. So I think one has to acknowledge it across the political spectrum, but to not note that we have seen behaviors and movements on the right that I think are more concerning. I don't think that's being harder on the right. Again, I think that's being appropriate.
How important is Donald Trump in this? I mean, you have this great metaphor. You call him the tuning fork for the temper of our age. But can you say a little bit more about that and the degree to which he is really a symptom of deeper factors and he's not so important in and of himself, or the degree to which you see him really as a catalyst and someone who has contributed to this in an important way?
Well, he's both. So, I mean, if you look at the mere fact of his appeal in 2015, 2016, the fact that he became the Republican nominee and then became president, granted with less of the popular vote by quite a bit than Hillary Clinton, but we have this thing called the Electoral College, and that's how that works. But he would not have had that success if there weren't so many Americans who thrilled to his depictions of himself and anybody who ran afoul of the liberal elite as being victims who were condescended to, right? And he was basically saying to them, less overtly then than he is now, vote for me as a way of taking your measure of revenge against the people whom you believe have left you behind and looked down on you. That was a central part. I mean, he was grievance made flesh, he was grievance made president. I mean, he's now become so explicit about it, that he says, I am your retribution. Vote for me, and that is the way that you take the ultimate revenge on the people you hate. He absolutely distilled and crystallized what was becoming a more and more common political tactic, which was the people you dislike are so awful, you need to vote for me as a way of getting back at them. We now have so many candidates. Ron DeSantis' whole campaign was this way, and to think of him as a failure is wrong-headed because he's the second-term governor of Florida. He didn't get the Republican presidential nomination, but he's come pretty far. And if you look at his political behavior and his political identity, it is all about getting back at the people we dislike, sticking it to Disney, sticking it to the Obamas and Martha's Vineyard by sending 2 plane loads of migrants that way, sticking it to Gavin Newsom by sending some more plane loads of migrants that way, sticking it to the prosecutor in Tampa who dared to say, no, I believe in abortion rights, and on and on. That goes beyond negative partisanship to something that I refer to in the book as apocalyptic partisanship, but I don't even think that gets at what it is. It's troubling when political engagement is fueled by hatred of the other side rather than any sort of idealism.
One of your big themes is Americans' declining trust in institutions. And when I think about what makes Trump different, this seems so important. I study primarily, for the last few years, I've studied kind of conservative Christianity in the context of America. And people ask a lot about evangelicals voting for Trump. And the more I've thought about it, the more it makes a whole lot of historical sense. There's a long tradition of American evangelicals making kind of pragmatic political bargains. They're very loyal to the Republican Party, have been for a long time. But it seems like the difference, and when you talk about violence, you talk about January 6th, the difference is this step toward absolute disregard for institutions. And when I think about, the great icon of grievance in the White House, maybe before Trump, Richard Nixon,
right?
The context there was one in which, it took a while, but his colleagues in the Republican Party eventually moved away from supporting him and stood by the institutions and the rule of law rather than supporting him. And that is the thing that seems to have shifted. And somehow grievances are now, they have this power. Our faith in institutions is so weak that they have this power to fuel something like January 6th that maybe is harder to imagine in a previous era.
It's not, there are components also in this of both extraordinary narcissism and extraordinary arrogance, right? It used to be you understood institutions to be larger than yourself. You understood institutions to represent many people, and that's why they were so important. When I think about the January 6th rioters, they were frenzied, they were savage, but above all, they were unhumble because they believed, right, either that there was no way the majority of people in the society could have voted differently than they did. Like they were so enamored of their own opinions and conclusions that had to be a false result. Or they believed that if more people actually wanted a different president, it didn't matter because they knew better. So of all the things that riot was, I think it was above all unhumble. And I think that's part of the disregard for institutions. I think it's a crisis of humility.
You have spent the past few years embedded in a very different institutional context in higher education. And you've written a lot about higher education. And this book, while it's not focused on higher ed, you don't let higher education off the hook. And I like to think that a major piece of what we're doing in the university classroom is trying to help students get better at getting beyond their own perspective and seeing the world from the perspective of people very different from themselves. And that seems like such an important antidote to what you're chronicling here. But something is going wrong.
I think something has gone a little bit wrong. I think our education system, and I don't think it's just higher education. I think it begins below that, certainly in secondary schools, maybe even below that. I think we're giving students some awfully reductive paradigms through which to see the world. And I think that's a problem. I think I'm not fully, but I'm somewhat on the Jonathan Haidt team that I think we, coddle is too, I think maybe mean and judgmental a word, but we're so worried about protecting children from any insult, from any bad feeling, etc., that I think we actually chip away at their resilience and also give some of them the sense that when something doesn't go their way, they should be enraged about it. No, that's life. Life is difficult. And the best tool I think to give them is an awareness of that and a sort of grit about figuring out how to work things out when the world doesn't conform entirely to your liking. No one should expect, this is what I mean by a crisis of humility, no one should expect his, her, or their life or their world to conform specifically to their liking. That's just not the way it works. But because we've been so focused on problems, I want to say something hopeful, okay? I do think there are problems with higher education. We just talked about some of them. My experience, and I take great hope from this, my experience in the classes I've taught at Duke when it comes to students has been a very, very positive one. If you say to students, if you make it clear what the values of your classroom are, and you and I have talked about this, and I think you've had a similar experience. If you make it clear that you value open debate, that you value ideological diversity, that you want people to color outside the lines of what's most comfortable, you want them to play with new ideas, you want them to respond positively and respectfully to classmates who disagree with them. I have had robust interesting conversations in my classrooms. I have brought in guest speakers who are radically different in their viewpoints from students, and there's never been an incident. I taught an opinion writing class, and I always bring it, I taught several sessions of it, I always bring in opinion writers from across the spectrum. I had Kevin Williamson Zoom in, right? He is a brilliant, brilliant writer on the right who got in a whole bunch of trouble because he said some pretty crazy things about his opposition to abortion. I told the students who he was. I said he's coming because he's a brilliant writer, and reading his stuff will make you better writers, and it'll be interesting to talk to him, and he'll probably have some work habits to share with you, some other things that will make you better. So you're going to read up on him. You're going to be really uncomfortable with some of what he said. Ask him about it. He's willing to answer questions. It went perfectly fine. Nobody complained to the dean. As I sit here now, I have not yet been served notice of my cancellation. Now, things could always change, but I think we're letting students down to some degree. They take cues from professors. They want one thing. This is not an insult, by the way. This is just kind of reality. Students want one thing above all else from their professors, and it's called an A. And if you make clear what pleases me is you toying with new ideas, is you encouraging ideologically diverse conversations, and on, well, shocker of shockers, they'll point in that direction, because there's no percentage in displeasing the professor. We have great leverage to have different classrooms than the ones that too many of us run.
Yeah, that exactly matches my experience. If you can set the tone at the beginning of the semester that this class is our common endeavor by which we're trying to get closer to truth and help one another do that, you can, I think, start to override the degree to which they are actually afraid of not so much the professor, but we know when we survey them, we've done this at UNC, you can read national data from outfits like the Knight Foundation. Students are afraid of one another. They're afraid of their peers, secretly recording them or posting some garbled version of what they have said on social media. And the more you can kind of overcome that atomized, we're all kind of in it for ourselves mindset and really create a common culture to the classroom, I think the better off. And they're so hungry for it.
Amen. Amen. Yeah.
You end this book on really a quite hopeful note. And you have a number of ideas about really reinvesting in institutions, it seems to me. And this will be my last question before we turn it over to audience Q&A, but I wondered if you could talk about maybe some of the ideas you lay out that you think are the most promising for correcting these cultural trends.
Well, I can't give you most promising because I actually think this is one of those problems, it's not quite a big enough word, but where I don't think there is any 1, 2, or 3 best, most hopeful solutions. I think it is about attacking it across various fronts in various ways. I think we need to have a much more serious conversation about various political reforms than we do. I think we need to look at those places that have managed to sort of ungerrymander themselves. There was a great story. I wish I could remember who wrote it because it would help me direct you to look it up. But there was a great story in the Times in the last 3 weeks about how Michigan became much more representative of its population than it had been because of various kind of political chicanery before then. So it's doable. I mean, we're living here in a state that is about, I lose track of where we are, but it's about to be re-gerrymandered to a fairly well, or maybe has been, right? We need much more of a public movement against gerrymandering, and it can work. It worked in Michigan. We need to look at the way we do our primaries. I'm a fan of open primaries. I'm a fan of nonpartisan primaries. I think that might be a path to having fewer extremist politicians in the House and more consensus builders. I think we need to look much more seriously than we have in a national service program. And I think people get stopped when that comes up because they think no one would ever agree to a compulsory national service program. But what people who haven't educated themselves on it don't realize is there's great hope for it being a broad scale thing without compulsory service. You can build in incentives. You can say to people who do it, you're first in line for certain job interviews. You can build a GI Bill component into it where rather than President Biden doing what he's doing now and just with a sometimes seemingly indiscriminate stroke of the pen saying, and now I relieve these debts, and now I relieve these debts. An interesting thing we could talk about, because I'm not sure what the political consequences of that are going to be in the end, but you could build education money, loan forgiveness incentives. I think we talk about national service. And I think we need to talk about some of the public investments we make. We can we can boost certain areas and we can design cities in a way that we encourage the crossing of paths of people who are not immediately alike. Think about, so we're in a bookstore, which is akin to a library. The library is still one of the few places in American life where if you walk in, obviously the diversity of people you see is to some extent constrained by geography. But in a library, you see people of all ages, you see people of all socioeconomic classes. My guess is if you did a survey, there would be more political diversity in that library than in certain other community groups. Public buildings, public squares, placing parks so that they're not bubbles within homogeneous communities, but so that so that the various sides of the park touch different kinds of communities and thus bring them into a common space. Those are just some of the many things we can do, but we need to recognize that we have that the stakes of doing this and the problem of letting Americans continue to sort themselves with ever greater efficiency into ever narrower categories is going to be the death of us.
What's so powerful about, I think, especially national service and some of the political reforms you're talking about, and this can be hard to keep in mind because they sound like such sort of big picture intimidating reforms, is you're really talking about not only putting people in the way of people who think very differently from themselves, but in a context in which they have to accomplish something practical. They have to elect a viable candidate who will appeal in a district that is, complicated. Or in the context of national service, it's not just about listening to one another, it's about actually getting to a point where we have enough understanding that we can execute something together. And that seems to me to be so important to cultural change.
Yeah, and I think it might make us less sternly and instantly and unforgivingly judgmental about the people in our lives. During one of the last sessions of the most recent class I taught at Duke, we were talking about in how many of our families, the students and I were talking about how in many of our families there were people with different political perspectives. That most of our families everybody wasn't on the exact same page. In my family, I have a number of two-time Trump voters. I don't know if any of them will be three-time Trump voters because I love them too much to get into that. But we were all talking about, in our families, we're able to see the people around us as being larger than their politics, larger than the way they voted in an election. We're able to see them as multidimensional human beings, and we wind up in the interests of not losing all of the things that bind us and all the things we enjoy about one another. We end up being able to extend one another a measure of grace. Why can't we do that for the American family? If we can do that for our own families, why can't we upsize that and just try to extend one another a bit more grace than we do?
Let's have some questions from you all. I think, Alex, should I hand my mic back to you?
Absolutely.
You're so close.
To what extent do you think that the decline of the sort of middle socioeconomic class has led to the rise of the grievance that you talk about?
I think income inequality more generally has a big part of it because if people, the kind of micro-tiered economy I talked about, or service economy, that wouldn't exist and wouldn't work unless you had people at such a range of incomes. And I think even more importantly than that is and this is part and parcel of the decline of the middle class, is the decline of social mobility, right? If you no longer believe that you have a decent or fair shot of bettering your life, well, of course you're going to feel aggrieved. And
or
of
your
course,
kids can do it, at least.
Well, and this is, it's sad if you, and I talk about this in the book, but if you look at survey data, over the last, half century, whatever. It used to be a given that when you asked a random sampling of Americans, do you think your children will have a better life than you did? And sadly, that question always meant or was specified as economics. We could have a whole other discussion about why we measure everything by financial health, right? But it was a given that a majority of Americans would say, of course I expect my children to. But that's no longer a given, and it's often not the case. I'll tell you one that really explodes my mind. For decades and decades now, Gallup, several times a year, has asked people, are you generally satisfied with the state of your life or this country? I forget the exact wording. And up until 2004, more often than not, it would be above 50%. But if it went below 50%, it would come back up. It went like this. But many moments in a year and many years, you got above 50%. We have not been above 50% in the answer to that question since 2004. For 2 solid decades without exception, never have a majority of Americans said they are not very satisfied, generally satisfied with life in this country. And more often than not, it's been below 40%, and there are plenty of years or moments in a year when it goes below 30%. It was at 11% after January 6th. That is really distressing.
Hi, so what you seem to be talking about is like, well, forgive me if I've like misinterpreted what you've said, but it seems like there's like this growing movement of individualism in this country that I already consider pretty individualist. And I think individualism is such a key part of the American psyche. How do you go about redefining the psyche of a country, especially when it seems like one of the best and most important things about it is also one of the worst things about it? And I've kind of noticed that like countries tend to come together in times of crisis or like there's an external threat, and kind of the last time I can think about that happening is 9/11, but you obviously can't engineer a crisis that brings people together. It doesn't work like that. So how do you even begin to go about thinking about redefining the psyche of a country as a whole? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's interesting you mentioned 9/11 because, and I write about this in the book, but when the what we were first calling the coronavirus pandemic, and now we refer to it as the COVID pandemic, when that first came along, and I think a lot of other people thought, okay, this is going to be one of those moments of national solidarity, because this is, as it first developed, it looked like and was, but this is an enormous threat. And this is a threat that touches us all. Yeah, there are ways, and the media wrote about this, there are ways in which certain people were more or less insulated from it, but at least theoretically, nobody could assume themselves to be safe from it, and it was something that was ambient, right? And I think it said a lot about what had happened to the country that you didn't see anything even remotely similar to what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, there were weeks when George W. Bush's approval rating, there were many when it was above 85%. I think at one point it went above 90%. I can't imagine in the next decade we will ever see a president have an approval rating at any moment above about 57% because of how tribal and partisan we've become, and because how much hatred flows from one side to the other. You mentioned individualism, and yes, we are a country that prizes individualism, but we are also a country, when people write about the greatest generation and what happened then, what they're writing about is a moment in time when people said, okay, individualism right now needs to take a back seat to some other stuff. Individualism and the collective good have always been in tension in this country. This is a really, and I write about this in the book too, our country is difficult, right? The things that make it great make it really difficult. It is great that we are constantly asking ourselves the question and trying to find the balance between individual rights and the collective good, because both of those things matter, and that is a judgment call every step of the way. It's part of what makes us great, though, that we just don't throw in on one or the other. Our diversity makes us great and singular, but one of the things we seldom pause to say, and we should, just to offer ourselves a measure of grace, is there is no historical example of a country of this size with diversity at this scale and diversity this diverse, or whatever the right adjective is, that we can point to and say, okay, we just do that and that's how it works out. A lot of what we're trying to do as a country that makes us so unique and makes us so great and makes us so glorious and makes this experiment so important doesn't necessarily run consistent with human nature. And so there are a lot of things in America that are in tension, and one is individualism versus the collective good. And I think we just try to balance that as best we can every step of the way, but that's never going to get easy, and there's never going to be a simple answer to that.
you mentioned in responding to questions that you hope that you would be asked a question about social justice and social justice groups. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, so I worry, and I'm quite explicit, I think, about this in the book. I worry that some of the fights that social justice warriors and that leftist progressives pick, some of the ways they wage those fights actually undermine important causes. And I'll give you a tiny but emblematic example that I use in the book. So obviously, we can never stop acknowledging and fighting against racism in the country, and anybody who thinks racism, that we're in a post-racism moment in America is not living in reality. Same goes for sexism, same goes for homophobia. What we can't do is cry wolf about those things in situations where they don't exist, because it makes the people who don't want to hear us, gives them an extra reason to tune out, and it makes the people who are pressing the causes of racism, the causes of fighting racism and sexism and homophobia, erodes their credibility. I was gobsmacked to see on social media, sometimes in larger publications, to see commentary when Brittany Griner was horrifically imprisoned and unjustly imprisoned in Russia, that said that she was languishing there and not getting the attention from American leaders that she deserved because she was being discriminated against as a Black lesbian woman. Brittany Griner we knew more about Brittany Griner as a political prisoner than any other political prisoner I can think of in the last 20 years. And in fact, many of us only learned about Paul Whelan, who still is imprisoned in Russia and had been a political prisoner for longer. We only learned about him through media coverage of Brittany Griner. Now, I'm not saying that the media covered Brittany Griner because they were pro-Black, pro-woman, and pro-lesbian. They covered her because she was a celebrity. But to enter the public square and to say, here, once again, we have a new example of racism, sexism, and homophobia because those things are your brand, that turns you from an effective advocate into a grievance entrepreneur. And there have been other situations like that, and that's what I'm referring to.
Bravo.
Hey, first want to say thanks so much for coming out here today. My question was, what are the limits of tolerance? In situations like this, when partisan polarization does become such a problem, I do think there's some legitimacy to the concern that it exists for a reason. So much, a lot of political scientists ascribe this current polarization to greater enfranchisement of the American public. And to refer back to your example of Bush post 9/11, I think a lot of people in this room would agree that that approval boost he got didn't end well for a lot of people. And just one last, I'll be honest, rather weird example was this podcast David Axelrod had. Seen some good stuff from it, but he also interviewed Henry Kissinger, interestingly enough, I think, last year before he died. And I guess to what degree do you think we should be able to tolerate those sorts of things, and how, if at all, should we draw the line as to what is and is not allowed in a civil society?
Well, I mean, these again are questions that are judgment calls and subjective, and I think many people would answer them in different ways. Where do you draw the line? You draw the line at violence, right? Where do you draw the line? You draw the line at a kind of hate speech that feels direly threatening to people in its immediate vicinity. I would not have a neo-Nazi zoom into my classroom. I would draw the line there. Sometimes it's hard to figure out whether someone classifies in a certain way. But it's a big question you ask, and it could be its own college course. But I want to address the Henry Kissinger thing. Now, I did not listen to the Axe Files podcast where he interviewed Henry Kissinger, but I think anybody interviewing Henry Kissinger is doing the right thing, because Henry Kissinger made an enormous impact on American history, and there are a lot of things to ask him, and there are a lot of things to have him answer for. It's crucial that I said I didn't hear the interview. What's important is when you interview someone like Henry Kissinger, or anyone who has a record of actions that is checkered and that beg questions about whether horrible things were done, you have to ask them tough questions. But I think too often there are people, I mean, we see this in complaints that the Times get, why did you even write about that person? That person should be deplatformed. That deplatformed person isn't going anywhere. They're not going away. The people who follow and want to hear from that deplatformed person will hear from them in another venue. And you're sort of trying to kind of launder the world into what it is not. Interview Henry Kissinger. Just make sure you ask him the right tough questions.
So thanks to both of you for an incredibly fascinating conversation. I think if Trump were here, he probably would have fallen asleep because he's doing a lot of that lately, from what I read. In 2012,
he's just resting his eyes. Don't be a partisan.
It's a column. In 2012, when President Obama got reelected, he said in a press conference that maybe now the fever will break with the GOP. That was the phrase he used. Here we are 12 years later, and I'm wondering if you think it will be the fever breaking with a Trump loss or something else that will get that party right, or if you believe that if we're going to recover from this, it will be an incredibly long time and slog and may not happen in some of our lifetime.
I think it'll be a long time. I don't know about incredibly. I mean, you know, I think we all dance around this because it's so depressing. But I mean, if Trump loses in early November, not only is the fever not going to break, the election's not going to be over. There's absolutely no reason to believe we won't see a repeat of January 6th or worse, because Trump is exhorting his supporters to do that even more, in an even more impassioned fashion than he did up to now. The question is what happens like 2 years later, right? What we don't know is what Trumpism and Trump's manner of political engagement looks like post-Trump. At some point he will fade. He may die. He may just kind of lose the energy to be in the public square. I don't know what that looks like, but it is unclear to me in how intense or widespread a form Trumpism, however you define that, will exist after him. And so I do think it's possible that we'll look up 10 years from now and we won't have a Republican Party that looks to us exactly like it does now. I mean, who knows though? We may see a different political alignment. I mean, I think, and a lot has been written about this, I mean, I think the kind of way we describe right and left and what we believe to separate right and left is actually does not do full justice to where people fall in various ways in terms of their political affiliations. So a lot could change.
Thank you. I wonder about I love the part about the tiers, and I wonder, rather than seeing it as a monetization, corporate monetization, whether we see it as a breadcrumbs to the masses, and which was normative service or baseline airplane conduct now has everybody scrabbling in grievance against each other rather than the corporate service failure. And so I think some of the manufactured grievance feels like that keeps people busy. As I think about the person who said, "I am platinum," the last time my flight was canceled.
Oh, I had a woman behind me in line. I'm losing track of what day it is because I've been on the road for a little bit, but I guess this was Sunday, and I was flying from Newark to Providence, Rhode Island to do an event in Providence. And I was on the normal line at United because I don't normally fly United. I don't have any accretion of miles. And there was some woman who was in this long line, but I guess she was United Platinum or Diamond or Galactic or whatever that is. Right? And she was freaking out because she knew there must be another line, but she didn't know where it was. And she was like, she asked me, she asked someone else, I mean, an adjective, she goes, do you know where the, whatever it was, the galactic line is? And I wanted to say to her, you might not want to be asking us serfs. Like, don't really put the question to us, because right about now, like, I'm thinking of the guillotine, you know? But we do need to, like, all of us, because I'm sure we're all guilty of it. You know, someone said to me, could government come in and get rid of these microclimates of privilege? That would be a terrible idea, a really terrible idea. But all of us can ask ourselves, like, what indulgences do we really need? You know, because everyone needs their indulgences to some extent, and there are matters of convenience that really make our daily lives work, right? But what do we really need, and when are we just friggin' flaunting it, right? And let's just kind of think about the effects even of the way we consume conspicuously, and whether we kind of need to be such a-holes.
And I think this will be our last question. Sorry, everyone.
Your development of the idea of an age of grievance is based almost entirely on events that have happened during your lifetime. It seems to me that there is a substantial fraction of the American population that has been living on a grievance ever since the outcome of the Civil War.
I'm just nodding. That was no question. That is undoubtedly true.
Perfect. Well, we are at time. It is 7:01, actually. So I will start, unless you guys want to take one more.
I'll take 2 or 3 more.
Okay.
I mean, Molly, if you have to go.
Thank you so much.
I'm really disappointed in this crowd because nobody has asked me the most urgent question. Where is Freddie Mercury's tambourine today?
That was my first question to you when I read the book.
I lost it. I looked up one day and I realized, what the hell ever happened to Freddie Mercury's tambourine? You know, now I don't know that I could have gone on eBay and gotten my retirement fund from it because I didn't have anything that authenticated it. But anyway, okay, your question is probably more important.
2 quick questions. You can answer either one. So the first one is, how in the world did you go from White House correspondent to a food critic to the New York Times, which seems like an incredible positive? And the second one, which is a little bit more serious, is do you see any hope for movement toward the censure? The late Joseph Lieberman was trying to construct a centrist movement. There was a little bit of clawing in that direction, and the whole thing fell apart. I think it would have fallen apart even without his untimely death. You can answer either one of them.
I mean, I'll answer both. How did I go from White House correspondent to restaurant critic? I was actually the Rome correspondent between then. It was really a simple matter of I'm an incredibly fortunate, privileged person, and in my years at the Times, there were a lot of editors there who felt, and I'm touched that they felt this way. That not only like could I educate myself quickly on, not only was I someone who was nimble enough and whose kind of reporting writing skills translated. I had editors who felt I was always doing my best work when I had a little bit of a learning curve and was kind of on new territory. And at that moment in time, they wanted a restaurant critic who was not a food naif, you know, who was not someone who hadn't been a fervent restaurant consumer throughout his, her, or their life, but they wanted someone who hadn't been writing food and restaurant copy for decades, which was the usual selection process. They thought it might be a fun experiment and interesting for readers and interesting for the paper to choose someone a little outside the box. And there I was, not the Jack in the box, but the Jack outside the box. In terms of hope, yeah, I do see hope. If what you want to believe is that centrism can still live, I think there's a lot about the structure of our political system that tries to stamp it out. But if you go back to 2020, Biden won the Democratic primary, and he was closer to the center in that field of Democratic contenders than almost anybody else. Not everybody. Tim Ryan, who dropped out earlier, would have been even closer. If you look at once we go below the national level to state levels, like we have governors who are governing from one party in states of a different color, and they're doing that by being extremely pragmatic, practical centrists. When Larry Hogan was the governor of Maryland, Maryland's one of the bluest states in this country. Two Hogan's a Republican. When he was governing Maryland, and when Charlie Baker, a Republican in one of the other bluest states in the country, Massachusetts, they had the two highest approval ratings of any governors in the country, and that meant Democrats in the state were happy with them. That suggests to me an appetite for centrism larger than the antics we see in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Our true final question.
Okay.
Raise your hands. I'm not stuck yet.
This isn't a question exactly, but I think we would be remiss if you didn't at least cover your thoughts about the current student protests on college campuses around the country. What is your take on that, the political consequences, and just the human nature of youth and their idealism? Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have really satisfying things to say about it because I think it's a very difficult situation to be approached with more nuance than it is always, than many people are. It saddens me to see so many political actors attaching kind of larger prisms, agendas, trying to score points with their actions. This is really tough. We value and we must protect fiercely freedom of speech, right? We also must recognize that it is fair to enforce law and order, that violence is unacceptable, and that anti-Semitism is unacceptable, right? Or at least you can't go into someone's heart and take feelings they have, but you can say in certain environments where people are feeling hideously threatened and disrespected, we're going to shut that down. We have kind of competing legitimate concerns here that make the adjudication of each one of these situations sometimes very difficult. When property is being destroyed, when there's violence, shut it down. Absolutely. Shy of that, I think these can be very, very tough decisions. I would not want to be a university president. I want students to be politically engaged, but I also want them to think harder than they often do about the feelings of people on the other side, why there's pushback, what they might be able to learn from that. And again, I wish the adults in the room would behave like the adults in the room and try to lead those conversations rather than just adding their own agendas to what's happening.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to get Frank over to the signing table in a moment. And so our first groups that are going to be called can join the signing line at that point. That's going to be anyone with a blue wristband or Group A. So that's Group A officially. All right.
Oh my gosh, it's the plane boarding.
Yes!
United Galactic, you're up first.
I got here at 5. Why am I not in Group A?
Thank you. It's nice to meet you. I look forward to it. I'm over on Quail Run. You're on. Yeah. No, you ran the service line.